Etta Mullins was 44, and for 9 years Nicholas County called her the quiet one. Plain no history. That was the whole of what folks knew, and they were satisfied with it. But every Thursday, she did a strange thing. She set a covered basket down at the far corner post, 3/4 of a mile out, where the pasture ran up against the timber. And then she walked back, never once looking behind her. At the Rensler supper table, they talked about it the way people talk about weather they can't do anything about. Curtis Rensler said it plainest. He was 28 and sure of everything. He put down his fork and he said, "Nobody walks that far in every weather for nothing but God." And under her bed, in a crate she thought no one had ever seen, there were 160 carved birds. Because here is the part nobody could account for. That basket always came back. The very next Thursday, it would be sitting at the post again, washed and dry. And inside it, every single time, one carved bird, a warbler, an owl, a pair of little wood ducks with their heads turned. 16 years of them. And in all that time, nobody knew whose hands had made them. And she never once said a word about it. If you believe kindness never goes unnoticed, this story is for you. Before we start, do me one kindness of your own. Subscribe so this walk doesn't get lost. And in the comments, tell me what county or state you're watching from. I want to see just how far this walk can travel. Now, let me take you to Ewell's Corner. It was 1935, and times were thin as creek ice. Ewell's Corner sat in a fold of Nicholas County, West Virginia, where the hills come together close and the light gets up late and goes to bed early. There was the church. There was the store with the one gas pump nobody could always afford to use. And there was the Rensler Hill Farm, riding the top of a long ridge with its back to the timber. Etta had kept that house for 9 years. She was not a big woman. She was not a small one. She had a face that people forgot the minute they turned away from it, which is a thing that happens to a certain kind of woman, and she had let it happen on purpose. Her hands were red at the knuckles from lye and from cold water. She wore her hair pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt, and maybe it did, and she never said. The Renslers paid her wages. Not much. Times being what they were, not much was a great deal to be grateful for. And she was. Harlan Rensler owned the farm, but the bank owned a good piece of Harlan. He was 60, and he carried a mortgage the way some men carry a bad tooth, always aware of it, always afraid of the day it would finally have to be dealt with. He didn't talk about it at the table. He didn't have to. Everybody in that house could feel the number sitting in the front room like a boarder who never paid. His wife was Maud. She was a soft-spoken woman who noticed things and mostly kept them to herself. And his son was Curtis, who noticed things too, but never kept a single one. Etta's wages went nowhere anybody could see. She wore the same 2 dresses. She bought no ribbon, no store candy, no picture show ticket down in the county seat. The money came in small, and it went out quiet, and nobody could tell you where. In a house that thin, a mystery like that has a way of growing teeth. Every week she took a Thursday half-day. That was in her arrangement from the start, and Harlan honored it because a bargain was a bargain. She'd do the morning work, the wash, and the noon dinner, and then along about 1 o'clock she would take off her apron, fold it over the chair back, and go. For 9 years, nobody had thought a thing of it. Now here is a small thing I need you to hold on to, because it comes back around. It came out one evening years before, the way old family talk drifts out when the lamp is low. Etta had had a brother. Older, he'd gone to France in the spring of 1918, same as a lot of the county's young men, and he had not come back with the ones who came back. The family Bible had his death date penciled in. Penciled, not inked. Somebody had meant to make it final, and had never once been able to bring themselves to do it. You can tell a great deal about a family by the marks they can't bring themselves to make permanent. Nobody thought about it. It was just a soft gray line on a Bible page. Waiting. Keep it. Now let me show you the basket, because the basket is the whole of it, and I want you to see it the way she packed it, one thing at a time. It was a Thursday in the spring, and I want you at that kitchen table with her. The house was empty. The Renslers were down at the lower field. Etta had the basket up on the scrub board, and she was filling it. A round of cornbread first, wrapped in a clean flour sackcloth, still holding a little of the oven's warmth. She laid it in careful, so it wouldn't crumble on the wok. Then a jar of soup beans, the lid screwed down tight, and a rag tied over it in case the lid failed. She held the jar a second against her apron, feeling the heat of it before she set it down beside the bread. A twist of salt, in brown paper, folded the way you fold it, so it doesn't spill. A box of matches, the kind with the sandpaper strike, brand new, the little drawer full. A spool of thread, gray thread. And you might wonder at thread going out in a food basket, but there it was, tucked down the side. And a shirt. A man's work shirt, blue, washed soft. The collar turned because she had turned it herself with small stitches so it would wear another season, folded so the men didn't show. She stood over it a moment. Then she went to the shelf and took down one thing more, and this is the thing that tells you everything, if you're listening. A small brown bottle. Paregoric, the medicine you give a body for pain, for a cough that won't quit, for nerves that won't lie down at night. She set the bottle in against the shirt where it wouldn't knock, and she laid the cloth over the whole basket, and she tucked the edges. You do not pack a basket like that for the Lord. You pack it like that for a grown man, a man who is cold and hungry and hurting, and cannot come down off the hill to say so. She carried it out the back way, across the yard, through the gate, out into the long pasture where the grass was coming up new and green, and the wind laid it over flat. 3/4 of a mile, up the slope and along the fence line to the far corner, where the last post stood at the place where the mowed ground stopped and the timber went dark and thick and climbed away up the ridge. She set the basket down at the foot of that post. She did not call out. She did not linger. She did not look up into the trees or say a name. She straightened her back, and she turned, and she walked home the way she'd come, not once looking behind her. That was the whole of it. That was the thing the county could not leave alone. Now watch what came back. The next Thursday, the basket was at the post, sitting up neat where she'd left it. But the cloth was different, folded another way than she folds it, and when she lifted it, the basket was clean. Washed, the jar rinsed, the crumbs gone, everything dry as if it had sat in the sun. Somebody with careful hands had tended it. And down in the bottom, on the bare weave, sat one small, carved bird, a warbler, cut from buckeye wood, pale and close-grained, no bigger than the top of her thumb. The little head cocked, the wing feathers marked in with a blade so fine you'd think a fingernail had done it. On the underside, the flat base was smooth, and there was something cut into it, small, that she ran her thumb over and did not need to look at. She stood in the wind, with that bird in her palm. Then she put it in her apron pocket, and she picked up the empty basket, and she carried it home. And that night, when the house was down and dark, she pulled out the crate from under her bed, and she laid the warbler in with the others. 159 already there. That made 160. 16 years of Thursdays. You do the arithmetic, and it stops your breath a little. Now, Curtis Rensler was not a stupid young man. That was the trouble with him. A stupid man would have let it go. Curtis was just clever enough to build a wrong house out of true bricks. He'd started watching the basket the way you watch a card player you don't trust. He noticed the weight of it going out. He noticed she was strong for a small woman and set-jawed on Thursdays. He noticed the box of matches. And one week, drying his hands at the porch basin while she was packing, he saw the little brown bottle go in. He carried all of it to the supper table like a dog bringing something up to the porch. "I'll tell you what she's doing," he said, and he waited till they were all listening. "She's running a still up in that timber." He laid it out. The matches, week after week. A body needs fire to cook mash and run a worm. The salt, The sugar? Well, there wasn't sugar, but he waved that off. The load she carried out and the empty she carried back. And the medicine. That's for a man that's poisoned himself on his own liquor, Curtis said. Or she's selling it along with the shine. Either way. There's a still up there, and she's the one keeping it. Harlan chewed and said nothing, but a line came down between his eyes. It was Maud who put her fork down. Curtis, she said, soft. A woman running a still doesn't turn a man's collar for him. Because Maud had seen the folded shirt in the basket once, and the turned collar, and it had lodged in her somewhere she couldn't name yet. Curtis didn't have an answer for the shirt. So he did what a certain kind of man does when he's caught short. He got louder about the parts he liked. The medicine, he said. You explain the medicine then, nobody could. And that was the little hook that kept the whole table on his line. Why the medicine? Why paregoric, week after week, carried up a hill to nobody? Etta was in the kitchen with the door part open. She heard every word of it. She did not come to the door. She scraped the plates, and she banked the fire, and her face did not change at all. But that was the first wrong theory. The still. And it was almost gentle compared to what came next. Spring turned toward summer. The theory of the still might have died on its own, for lack of anybody ever finding a still, except that Curtis needed to be right more than he needed to be careful. And a man like that will always trade up to a worse idea if the worse idea is more exciting. It happened on a Saturday, out at the barn, and there were people to hear it, which was the whole point. There was a hired hand named Poole helping with the hay, and Ollie Trent had come by with a wagon to borrow a tool, and the three men were standing in the barn lot in the heat. Etta was up at the house, but the kitchen window was open and the barn lot carried. Curtis had a straw in his teeth and his thumbs in his belt. You want to know about our housekeeper, he said, loud enough. Plain little thing, keeps to herself. 16 years she's been carrying baskets up to that far corner. Food, a man's shirt. And you tell me. He looked from Poole to Ollie and back. What does a plain woman with no husband carry a man's shirt into the woods every week for? Turned collar and all? He let it sit. She's got a man up there, Curtis said. Keeps him like a dog on a chain. Feeds him, dresses him, doses him quiet with that medicine so he stays put. 16 years, he shook his head, pleased as sin. The quiet ones. It's always the quiet ones. Ollie Trent looked at his boots. Poole laughed. The ugly little laugh a man gives when he's not sure he ought to, but the boss's son started it. And up at the house, at the open window, Etta heard the plain little thing, and the keeps a man, and the always the quiet ones, and she heard the laugh. She was setting the table. She had the forks in her hand. She did not drop them. She did not go to the window. She did not cry. And she did not go out to the barn lot to stand in front of those three men and tell them what a filthy, foolish, wrong thing that was. She set the last fork square by the last plate. She smoothed the cloth. She went to the stove and turned the beans so they wouldn't catch. And that was the worst of it, if you want to know. Not the lie. The way she just kept setting the table while the lie went around the barn lot, because she had learned a long time ago that defending herself was the one thing she could never once afford to do. To argue was to explain. To explain was to name. And to name was the one thing that would take everything she'd walked all those Thursdays to protect. So she held her tongue, and she set the table, and the shame that should have been Curtis's, she carried instead. Because she could carry it, and he could not have carried the truth. But that lie had a cost, and it came due fast. Harlan Rensler was a decent man in the ways that don't require courage, and a weak one in the way that a mortgage makes a man weak. Talk had gotten around. The still was one thing. Half the county ran a little something, and nobody minded much. But a woman keeping a man in the woods, said out loud in front of a hired hand who had a mouth, that was scandal. And scandal was a thing Harlan could not have sitting on his land, not with his name down at the bank on a paper he couldn't miss a payment on. He came to the kitchen one evening, turning his hat in his hands, and he did not look at her when he talked. "Etta," he said, "you've been good to this house." She knew what a sentence like that is the front porch of. "There's talk," he said. "I don't hold with it. But talk against a house is a hard thing when a man owes what I owe. You understand me." "I understand you, Mr. Rensler," she said. He wanted her to explain. You could see it. He wanted her to give him one clean reason he could carry back to the county and to himself, so he wouldn't have to be the man who put her out on a rumor. He stood there, and he gave her all the room in the world to defend herself. She gave him nothing. She stood by the stove with her hands folded in her apron, and she looked at the floor, and she let him think whatever he was going to think. Because, and she never said this to him, she only turned it over inside herself in the dark. What he was afraid of was a shame. A word in the county's mouth. And what she was afraid of was not a shame at all. It was a paper in a courthouse, and a paper in a hospital. It was a thing with a stamp on it, and a signature, and a wagon that comes for a man. And there was no way on this earth to explain the second fear without handing over the very thing that made it real. So Harlan turned his hat, and he told her to see that the talk died down. And he left the kitchen with the matter half settled, and his conscience worse than when he'd come in. She had one foot off the edge of that farm, and she knew it, but she kept walking the Thursdays. There was never any question of stopping. Stopping was the one thing that couldn't happen. She'd have walked with the whole county at her back before she'd have missed a single post. Curtis, meanwhile, had gotten it into his head to prove himself. A man who said a thing that loud in front of witnesses either finds out he's right or spends the rest of his life being wrong in public, and Curtis could not abide the second. So one Thursday he followed her. He gave her a start up the pasture, then came along the fence line low, keeping to the shade of it, feeling clever. She went up the slope steady the way she always did, the basket on her arm, not hurrying, not once looking back. And why would she look back? She'd never had a reason to in 16 years. Near the top the ground breaks up. The mowed pasture gives out, and the timber comes down to meet it in a tangle of laurel and mossed over rock, big gray shells of it heaved up out of the hill, and little runs of water going down between. It is country that looks open until you're in it, and then it closes around you and turns you. Curtis watched her reach the corner post. He watched her set the basket down. And then he crossed the last open ground to catch her at it, to see the man, to be right. And she was gone. Not run. Not hidden. Just gone, the way a deer is gone, into the laurel. And the rock took her footsteps, and the water took her sound. And Curtis stood at the corner post with his chest heaving, and the empty timber going up and up in front of him, dark and quiet, and full of nothing he could see. He went up and away, thrashed around in the laurel, barked his shins on the rock, got himself turned so he came out lower down than he went in, and had to walk the fence to find the corner again. And the whole time he had the feeling, every man who has ever gone up that ridge has had it, the feeling of being watched by something that will not be found. He came down that evening, scratched and furious, and no longer sure of a single thing except that he was not going to say he'd lost her. So he made it grander. Because grander is what fear does. By the time it reached the deputy down at the county seat, it wasn't a still and it wasn't a lover. It was a dangerous man. Curtis said it low, like it cost him. There's a man hiding up on the Rensler Ridge, living wild, fed by the housekeeper. A man who doesn't want to be found. And you tell me what kind of man doesn't want to be found. A criminal. A fugitive. Somebody the law would want to know about. He half said it and half took it back, the way a coward accuses, leaving himself room. The deputy wrote something down. Nothing came of it that week. But a thing had been said to the law now, out loud, and things said to the law do not stay said. They wait in a drawer. That was 3 wrong theories in one spring. The still, the lover, the fugitive, and every one of them was built out of true bricks. The matches were real, the shirt was real, the man on the ridge was real, and every one of them was dead wrong about what those true things meant. But the birds knew better, and they were telling anyone who cared to look. Because here is what was happening in the crate under the bed, week on week, that nobody in the county ever saw. The carvings were getting finer. The early ones, years back, had been simple. A blocky little bird, more idea than bird, the kind of thing a man whittles to keep his hands busy. But somewhere along the line, the hands had woken all the way up. That spring, in the bottom of the washed basket, Etta had found a great horned owl. She held it under the lamp a long time. It stood no taller than her palm, but it was all there. The ear tufts, the heavy brow that gives an owl that look of judging you. The feathers were cut in ranks, fine and overlapping, so that when you turned it under the light they seemed to lift a little. And down at the base, where the 2 feet gripped the branch, the toes were carved separate, each one curled over the wood. But it was the joint that stopped her. Where the branch met a little crosspiece, the wood was fitted together in a way that a body doesn't whittle. It was cut. Cleanly, tightly, the 2 pieces let into each other so snug you could barely find the seam. That is not the work of a man passing time. That is the work of a man who once, in another life, made things you sat in and leaned back on and trusted with your whole weight. A man who knew joints, who knew wood the way you know a language, from the inside from before, a chairmaker. Now I want you to have all the pieces, because the county never did, and there is a particular ache in watching a puzzle stay broken in front of people who won't turn the last piece over. A man on the ridge, 16 years hidden, a shirt with a turned collar, a bottle of paregoric for pain that won't quit and nerves that won't lie down, a brother gone to France in 1918 and penciled dead, hands that knew how to cut a chair joint before ever they were taught to hold a rifle. You have it now, don't you? You have had it for a while. A man who went to the war and did not die there, whatever the pencil said. A man who came home so broken in the body and the mind that he could not or would not come home at all. A man his sister fed and clothed and doctored, week on week, in the only way the world had left open to him, from a distance, without a word, at a fence post, so that no paper and no wagon and no hospital would ever come for him. The county had a dangerous man on the ridge. The truth had a wounded one. And between those 2 words is the whole of this story. Now the last thing, before I leave you at the fence, and it is the small thing that turned everything. Years before, 5 years, 6, Etta had done a thing she almost never did. She had given one of the birds away. Ollie Trent's little girl had been sick, near to dying one winter, and had pulled through it, and Etta, who had nothing else to give that meant anything, had pressed into Ollie's hand a carved wood duck. A drake, with its head turned back over its shoulder, and a little curl of feather at the tail cut, just so. For the child, she'd said, and nothing more, and Ollie had thanked her and taken it home and set it on a shelf, and it had sat there ever since, gathering the ordinary dust of an ordinary house. Ollie never once thought to ask where she'd got it. That's the thing about a plain woman with no history. You don't ask her where she got the finest carved duck in 3 counties. You just say thank you. But that summer, a woman came through Ewell's Corner in a dusty government car, and her name was Miss Helen Cobb. She worked for the Federal Art Project, out of the Index of American Design. And if that means nothing to you, here is what it meant. The government, in those thin years, had sent educated people out into the hills and the hollows to find the things ordinary hands had made. The quilts, the pots, the coverlets, the carvings, and to draw them, and record them, and set them down in a great national book of American work, so they wouldn't be lost. Miss Cobb had an eye trained for exactly one thing, the difference between a nice piece and a real one. She stopped at the Trent place, asking after old quilts, and on the shelf, behind a lamp, gathering dust, she saw the wood duck. She went still the way Etta had gone still under the lamp. She picked it up without asking, which was not her manner, and she turned it in the window light, and she saw the turned head, and the feather, and the base cut smooth and true. And Miss Helen Cobb, who had handled 1,000 carvings from Maine to the Georgia line, felt the hair go up on her arms. "Mr. Trent," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "Where did you get this?" Ollie, pleased and unsuspecting, told her the truth. The Rensler housekeeper gave it him. Years back. "For the child." "And where?" said Miss Cobb. "Did she get it?" And Ollie Trent, who had never once thought to wonder, shrugged and said he was sure he didn't know. That was the spark. From that hour, Miss Helen Cobb had exactly one purpose in Nicholas County, and it was to find out who had carved that duck and to get the name down in the record where it belonged. She began to ask. At the store, at the church, anywhere a plain housekeeper's name might come up. Who carves? Who whittles up on those ridges? Who made this? And the county, which had been telling itself a still and a lover and a fugitive all spring, now had an educated government woman going door to door, asking after the very man they'd been lying about. Except she wanted to praise him, and they wanted to hang him, and neither of them knew the first true thing about who he was. Word of it reached the hill. It always does. Etta heard it at the store, the way you hear the thing you dread, sideways, from a mouth that means nothing by it. A government lady asking who carved Ollie Trent's duck. Asking after the maker. Wanting, folks said, to write it in a book. To put a name to it. A name. She stood in the store with her hand flat on the counter, and to anybody watching she was just the quiet housekeeper counting out coins for thread. But inside her, 16 years of careful walking had just come up against the one word that could undo all of it. Because a name meant a file, and a file meant a paper, and a paper meant a wagon coming up the pasture for a man the government had penciled dead in 1918 and would, if it found him breathing, want very much to put behind the walls of a place he had once walked out of, rather than let it swallow him. She could have burned the crate. She could have stopped the walk. She could have decided, right there, for both of them, the way she decided everything for 16 years, carried it alone, kept him hidden, protected him, even from the choice. But that Thursday, when she packed the basket, she did something she had never done in all those years. She put a question in it, and she carried it up the long pasture to the far corner post, where the mowed ground stops and the timber climbs away into the dark, and she set it down. And this time, God help her, she did not know what would come back. She did not sleep that week. 7 days is a long time when you have put a question into the dark and asked the dark to answer. She went about her work. She scrubbed the plank floors. She hauled ash from the stove and set bread to rise and turned the collars of Harlan's shirts. But her hands did it. Not her. Her was up on the ridge, in a rock house she had never once entered, waiting on a man to tell her whether he wanted to be seen. Because that was the thing she had never done. In 16 years, she had decided everything. She had decided he would live. She had decided he would stay hidden. She had decided, every Thursday, what he ate and what he wore, and whether he had medicine for the nights his lungs remembered the gas. She had carried the whole weight of him alone, and she had never once asked him to lift a corner of it. Now she had. And Miss Helen Cobb was still in the county. The government woman had taken a room at the boarding house in Yule's Corner. She had a leather case and a fountain pen, and a way of asking questions that sounded like praise. She went to Ollie Trent's again. She turned the wood duck over in her hands under the window light, and she said the word Etta feared most. Whoever made this, Cobb said, belongs in the record. Ollie only shrugged. Etta give it me. Housekeeper up at Rensler's. Long while back. So Cobb went up the pike toward the Rensler Hill. But Curtis got there first with a worse idea. Curtis had been chewing on his failed follow all spring. He had trailed Etta up the pasture and lost her in the laurel. And a man like Curtis does not lose a woman in the woods and decide he was wrong. He decides he needs help. So he rode to the county seat. He sat across a desk from the deputy and said there was a man hiding on his father's ridge. A dangerous man. A man nobody had ever seen. And the deputy, who had a drawer and a pencil and not much else to do, wrote it down. That written record sat in that drawer like a coal that had not decided yet whether to be a fire. And Thursday came. Etta packed the basket the way she always had. Cornbread wrapped in a cloth. A jar of soup beans. A twist of salt. She did not put a new question in it. She had asked. Now she only carried. She went up the long pasture where the mowed ground gives way to timber, and she set the basket at the far corner post, and she walked back down without looking behind her. She did not know that 3 men were about to walk up the same ground. Curtis came with the deputy, and Cobb, hearing at the boarding house that the law was riding to the Rensler place about the very ridge her carver seemed to haunt, put on her sensible shoes and came too. She did not want a fugitive caught. She wanted a name for a card. But the road was the same road, and so the 3 of them went up together. The deputy heavy and bored, Curtis certain and sweating, and the government woman with her leather case. They reached the corner post at 1 o'clock. The basket sat where Etta had left it. And on top of the post, tucked against the wood, was a thing that stopped Helen Cobb in her tracks. A carving. Fresh, pale buckeye, the shavings barely off it. A warbler, wings folded, head cocked as if it had just heard something in the brush. Cobb picked it up like a woman picking up a live coal that did not burn. "Look at this," she breathed. "Look at the eye. Look at the way the feather breaks at the wing." She turned it over. On the base, cut small and clean, a date. This was made this week. He is up there. Right now. The deputy squinted at the timber. Man could be anywhere in that. Curtis pushed past them into the laurel. "He's here. I told you he was here." He shouted into the trees. He beat the brush with a stick. He climbed a rock ledge and slid back down it with his palms bleeding. But the ridge kept its man. You do not find someone in that timber by making noise. Vernon Mullins had watched that fence line for 16 years. He knew the sound of Etta's step, and he knew the sound of everything that was not Etta's step, and 3 men crashing up the pasture at 1 o'clock had reached him long before they reached the post. He was already gone. Up through the rocks, into the dark green, into the country he had made himself small enough to disappear inside. They found nothing. No still. No cabin they could see. No man. But Cobb went back down the hill holding the warbler, and she had 2 things now she had not had that morning. She had proof the carver was real and living. And she had a place. That was the day the machine woke up. Cobb did what a careful government worker does. She wrote it on a card. Index of American Design, Field Note, Nicholas County, West Virginia. Carver unknown, living, extraordinary skill, associated with the household of one Etta Mullins, housekeeper. She meant nothing by it but honor. She did not know that a card in one office speaks to a paper in another. She did not know that when she wrote the name Mullins and the county and the year, a clerk somewhere would go looking for a Mullins to match it to, and would find one. Vernon Mullins. Enlisted 1917. Meuse Argonne. Listed dead, spring of 1918. Pension unclaimed for 16 years. And behind that, in a different drawer, in a different hand, an old commitment order from the Veterans Hospital he had walked out of before they could sign it. A man ruled unfit, disappeared, never recovered. A dead man who was not dead. An unfit man who was alive. That is the exact shape of thing the walls are built to hold. The wagon Etta had feared for 16 years was, for the first time, a real wagon on a real road. She did not know it yet, but someone in the house was about to learn everything. And it was not Curtis, and it was not the deputy. It was Maud. Maud Rensler had been watching Etta all spring. Not the way Curtis watched hunting for vice. Maud watched the way a woman watches another woman, and knows there is grief in her before she knows the cause. She had seen Etta pack that basket. She had seen the paregoric go up the hill once, and had heard Curtis crow still and known, in the soft private way she knew things, that a still does not need medicine. So on the day the men went up the ridge, Maud went into Etta's room. She told herself she was after mending. She was not. She got down on her knees by the narrow bed, and she pulled out the crate. It was heavy. It scraped on the floor. She lifted the lid, and Maud Rensler put her hand over her mouth. Birds, rows of them, wrapped in scraps of cloth and paper, layered down into the dark of the crate, more than she could count from where she knelt. A warbler. An owl with its ear tufts sharp as thorns. A pair of wood ducks, drake and hen. The drake's head a green she could almost see under the pale wood. Each one perfect. Each one made by a hand that knew what it was doing before it ever picked up a knife. And when she turned them over, she turned a dozen over. Then a dozen more, she found the same thing on every base. A date. Not a year, a Thursday. Cut small and clean into the wood, week after week after week, going back and back and back. She was counting without meaning to. She stopped at 60 and knew there were twice that, 3 times. And near the bottom, wrapped alone, she found one that was not a bird. A flat piece of buckeye, no wings, no eye. Just 2 letters cut into it, V and M, and a date that was not a Thursday. A date in the fall of 1918. A place word she did not know. A word that would have meant nothing to Maud, but meant, to the men who had been there, everything. Meuse, Argonne. Maud knelt on that floor a long time, and one by one, in her quiet mind, the stories the county had told itself, all spring lay down and died. Not a still, not a lover, not a fugitive, something else. Something the whole loud county had walked straight past, because it was too plain to be interesting and too tender to be believed. She put the birds back. She put the crate back. She wiped her eyes on her apron and went and made supper, because that is what women like Maud do while they decide what a thing means. She did not have to decide long, because the men came back. And 2 days after that, a letter came for the county seat, forwarded from a state office, asking after one Vernon Mullins, presumed deceased, believed living, subject to a standing order of commitment, asking that the sheriff make inquiries. Now it was all in the same house at the same time. The card, the letter, the crate, the deputy's report, the government woman down at the boarding house with a warbler in her case, and a name half written. And Etta, who still did not know her question, had already been overtaken by the world. Harlan called them all together in the kitchen. He did it because he was frightened. His farm rode on a mortgage, and a mortgage rides on a reputation, and there was law and government both circling his hill now over a housekeeper he had never once bothered to know. He wanted it settled at his own table, where he could see it. So on a gray evening, he had 'em all in the kitchen, Maud at the stove, Curtis by the door with his thumbs in his belt, the deputy holding his hat, and Helen Cobb, who had been asked to come, and had come because she wanted, more than anything, to finally meet whoever it was that stood behind that warbler. And Etta. Harlan told her to stand where they could all see her. He said there were questions. He said the government wanted a man they thought she was hiding. He said, and his voice was not unkind, that she had better tell it, all of it, right now, before the law told it for her. Etta looked at the room, at Curtis by the door, so sure of himself, waiting to be proven right, at the deputy with his hat, at the government woman with the eyes that meant no harm and could do so much, at Maud, who would not meet her look, and by that she knew Maud already knew. She had walked 3/4 of a mile in every weather for 16 years and never said a word. Now she was going to have to say all of them. So she did. "My brother," she said, "is not dead." The kitchen went so quiet you could hear the fire. "His name is Vernon Mullins. He is 52 years old. He went to France in 1918 and he was in the Meuse Argonne, and a shell took the front of his face. And the doctors built it back twice, and it never did come right. And the noise of it stayed in him. The nights are bad. His lungs remember the gas. She was not crying. Her voice was flat and plain. The voice of a woman reading a ledger she had carried a long time. They told us he died that spring. They penciled it in the Bible. And then, that fall, he came home. Not to the house. He couldn't. They wanted to put him in a place, sign a paper and put him behind a wall. A man who'd already had a wall of dirt come down on him once. He walked out of that hospital before they could sign it. And he came home to the only country he trusted. The Ridge. She looked at the deputy. There is no still. There is no dangerous man. There is a chairmaker who cannot bear to be looked at, living in a rock house on my employer's ridge, and I have fed him every Thursday for 16 years. The deputy looked down at his hat. Then she turned, slow, and she looked at Curtis. You said a still. Her voice did not rise. That was the terrible part. It did not rise at all. There's no still. You said a lover. He's my brother. You said a dangerous man hiding in the woods. She let it sit. He's a soldier this country decorated and then buried alive on paper. You went to the law about a man who gave more for you than you have given for anything, and you did it to be right. Curtis opened his mouth. Nothing came out of it. There is a particular silence a proud man makes when the thing he was sure of turns to ash in his hands. Curtis made it. He had wanted, all spring, to be proven right. He had gotten his wish in the worst possible way. Every theory he had shouted at the supper table lay dead on the kitchen floor, and he was standing over them, and there was nothing to say that would not make it worse. So he said nothing. He would go on saying nothing about it for the rest of his life. But Etta was not finished. Because the county had gotten her exactly backward, and she was done being carried backward. She crossed to the crate. Maud had brought it down without being asked. It sat on the kitchen table now, and Etta lifted the lid, and she began to take them out. One, then another, then a row of them, standing them up on the oilcloth in the lamplight, and the whole room leaned in without meaning to, because they were beautiful, and beauty in a plain kitchen makes people forget to breathe. Everybody in this county thought I was keeping him alive, she said. She set a wood duck down. She set the great horned owl down beside it. A helpless man in the woods, and the poor housekeeper hauling him his supper out of pity. She turned one over. She showed them the base. The date cut into it. He never once let me. She said it quiet, and it landed like a struck bell. Every Thursday for 16 years I set that basket down, and every Thursday it came back washed and dry with one of these inside it. He has never in 16 years taken a single delivery he did not answer. 160 birds, near 830 Thursdays. You think I fed him? She looked around the room, at every one of them. He's been paying me, a man with a rebuilt face and a bad chest, and the only coin he's got left in the world. Every basket I set down came back paid. Nobody spoke. Helen Cobb had come up that hill wanting a name for a card. She had thought she was documenting an anonymous folkmaster, some untaught genius in the hills. She stood now in a farmhouse kitchen and understood she had walked into the middle of something far larger than a credit line. She looked at the birds on the table. She could not help herself. She was a trained eye, and a trained eye knows when it is in front of the real thing. May I? She said softly. Etta nodded. Cobb picked up the great horned owl. She turned it in the lamplight. She ran her thumb along the joint where the tuft met the skull, and her professional voice, the one she used for the record, came out gentle and certain. These joints, she said. The way he's cut this, that's not a whittler. That's a joiner's hand. A furniture hand. He worked wood for a living before the war. She set the owl down and lifted the warbler, the little Buckeye one, the twin of the one in her case. I have been across 4 states for this project. I have cataloged a great deal of very good work by very fine people. She looked up at Etta. I have not seen a hand this good. Not once. These belong in the index. The warblers, the owl, that pair of ducks. This is a museum's worth of carving. Made in a rock house by a man everyone in this county spent a whole spring calling a criminal. And there it was. The plain woman with no history had in plain sight run a 16-year relief operation out of her own small wages and never let a soul see it, and without meaning to, had preserved the finest folk carving a government expert had ever put her hands on. Both true. Both hers. The quiet one. For a moment the kitchen was almost warm with it. And then Etta's face changed, because she remembered the letter. The commitment order. The wall. She turned to Cobb, and the fear came back into her plain voice, and it was worse than any anger. You want to write his name. I want to honor him, Cobb said. A name is a file, Etta said. You honor him with a name, and the state finds a dead man breathing and an old paper that says unfit. And they send a wagon, and they put him behind a wall to die, where nobody has to look at his face. Her voice broke once on the word wall, and then steadied. He walked out of that place once. He would not survive it twice. I would rather he stay a mystery in your book forever than have you give the machine his name. And here is where it could have gone wrong. Here is where the government woman could have become the thing Etta feared. She had the name half written. She had the location. She had every reason of duty to file it clean and complete. Helen Cobb looked at the birds a long time. Then she said, "The index records the work. It does not have to record the man." She said it slow, like a woman deciding something she would not undecide. I can catalog every one of these as the work of an anonymous carver, Nicholas County, and it will be true, and it will stand 100 years, and no name will ever go on any card that any office can pull. She looked at the deputy. As for the other paper, a man listed dead in 1918 is a clerk's error, and clerk's errors get closed. There's no fugitive here. There's a paperwork mistake and a housekeeper's sick kin. I'll say so in writing, and my word carries a federal seal. Let it close. The deputy, who had never wanted any of this, nodded like a man let off a hook. He would go back and put a line through his own report. There would be no wagon. And that was the moment the wall came down, without ever being built. But there was one thing left, and it was the hardest, and Etta was the only one in the room who understood it. None of them could decide this. Not Harlan, whose land it was. Not Cobb, with her seal. Not the deputy. Not even Etta. Because for 16 years, the one thing she had done wrong, the one weight she had carried that was never hers to carry, was deciding for him. And she was not going to end it by deciding for him again. The decision was Vernon's. So it went the way everything between them had always gone. It went in the basket, up the pasture, to the far corner post where the mowed ground stops and the timber climbs into the dark. That Thursday she packed it careful. The cornbread, the beans, the salt, and a folded piece of paper, and on it, in the plain hand of a woman who had never once asked him for anything. The whole of it. That a government lady wanted to put his birds in a book. That his name would not go in it. That no one would ever come. That the birds could be seen by the world, honored, counted at last. Or could stay theirs alone, up the hill, if that was what he wanted. She told him it was his to answer. She told him she would carry whatever came down. She set the basket at the post. She walked back without looking behind her. And the county waited, though it did not know it was waiting, and the government woman waited at the boarding house, and Maud waited, and even Curtis, in whatever was left of him after that kitchen, waited. The next Thursday the basket sat at the post. Washed, dry, and inside it, one carving. A warbler, buckeye, pale, wings folded, head cocked as if it had just heard something in the brush. Etta stood at the post in the wind and turned it over to read the date the way she had read 800 dates before it. But it was not a date this time. He had carved words into the base. Small, clean cut by a joiner's hand that knew wood before it knew a rifle. Just a few. Enough, show the birds. Not the man. He had answered. In the only voice the war had left him, from the only country he trusted, a man the government had penciled dead and the county had called a criminal, had reached down and taken hold of his own fate and told them exactly how much of him the world was allowed to have. The work, yes. Let it be counted. Let it be honored. Let it stand 100 years. The man, no. The ridge would keep the man. Etta closed her hand around the warbler, and for the first time in 16 years, standing at the far corner post, with the timber going dark above her, she cried. Not from grief, from the other thing. The thing that has no good name. The thing you feel when a weight you carried alone for half your life is, at last, carried by two. And that was how it went into the record. Helen Cobb cataloged them through the fall. Every bird. She wrote on the card what was true, and only what was true, the work of an unnamed master carver. Nicholas County, West Virginia, a chairmaker's hand, the finest the field worker had documented. No name, no location a wagon could follow. The warblers, the great horned owl, the pair of wood ducks, all of it entered where it would be kept, and honored, and never once threatened. The machine that had stirred to life went back to sleep with nothing to hold. There was no wagon. There was never a wagon. The seasons turned the way they do. The crate came out from under the bed. Maud saw to that. It went onto a shelf in the front room where the light could reach it, and a few of the birds, the owl, the drake, the first buckeye warbler, went up on the mantel, where a body could look at them of an evening. Harlan Rensler, who had assumed the quiet have no story, learned that the quietest person on his land had been running the truest thing on it the whole time, and he never again mistook plain for empty. Curtis Rensler stayed at that farm. He sat, some Thursdays, at the same kitchen table where he had once said still and lover and dangerous man, and he watched his mother pack a basket. And he said nothing. He had wanted to be proven right. He had gotten it. It had cost him the one thing a proud young man values most, which is the belief that he sees people clearly. He would carry that quietly for the rest of his life, and it was, in the end, the only true sentence anyone served. The basket still went out on Thursdays. That never changed. But sometimes now, Maud walked part of the way with Etta, up the pasture to where the mowed ground ends, and stopped there, and let Etta go the last stretch alone to the post, the way it had to be. And the birds still came back. Now and again, two of them. In the summer of 1936, when the government finally sent the veterans their bonus, the money owed the men who went to France, a payment came for one Vernon Mullins, and there were those who would have called that impossible, a payment for a dead man. But a housekeeper knew how to receive a thing quiet and carry it up a hill, and she did. And what a chairmaker on a ridge did with money after 16 years of needing none is between him and the timber. Vernon was never seen by the house. Not once. The ridge kept him to the end, the way he wanted, the way he had earned. But the carvings kept coming down the pasture in a covered basket, every Thursday, washed and dry, one small bird inside, and every single one of them, to the last, was paid. Because that was the thing the whole Loudoun County had gotten backward. They spent a spring sure she was feeding a helpless man out of pity. She never was. He never let her. For 16 years, 3/4 of a mile in every weather, a woman with no history carried a basket to a fence, and a man the world had buried alive carved his way, one warbler at a time, back to being a man who owed nothing to anyone. The walk was seen at last. The birds were counted, and the debt, all 830 Thursdays of it, came out even. If this one stayed with you, tell me the county or the state you're watching from. I'd like to know how far this walk has traveled.